Super.
Okay. So thank you very much for having me here, and I also would like to thank the university and my foundation for the funding of this research. So very useful. This was work with Jacopo Perego, and part of it with a student of mine at UCSD, Alexander Lepcon. This is about the value of data records and privacy. I know that some of the terminology that I'm using is perhaps different from the mainstream use, and I hope that you will help me connect it with the mainstream, especially when it comes to what data records are and what privacy is. So in this research, so we start from we are motivated by the observation that personal data has become an essential input in modern industries, so much so that people start to talk about data as the new oil. And as a result of that, data markets have been growing rapidly and giving rise to many questions for policymakers and regulators. And we think that one important question to address is the following: how much value is created by the data of each individual? Okay? For instance, if you think about an e-commerce platform, when is it the case that one consumer data is more valuable than another consumer data? And related to that, how much is a platform willingness to pay for each specific consumer data? We think that this is important to have a better understanding of the demand for data, which is more and more considered as a new asset class for companies. And also, if we want to think about designing markets where consumers are compensated for their individual data, it's useful to know what's the value of that data. Related to this, we may wonder what's the effect of privacy regulations on the value of individuals' data, because introducing privacy regulation can create redistributive effects between firms, which are usually called data users or data holders, and us, the individuals who are called data subjects. By the way, I timed this presentation for 20 minutes, so feel free to ask as many questions as you want during or after as you wish, or ask for details if you want to hear what. So in a nutshell, what we do in this line of research is the following. First of all, we make the observation that personal data is often used to influence the behavior of multiple agents who interact strategically. And this influence is achieved either by providing information or by shaping the incentives of these agents. So for example, personal data is used to intermediate trade between buyers and sellers in e-commerce. It's used to target and sell ads in search or in social media. It's used to match employers like riders and workers like drivers in the gig economy. Now, in these cases, data is used as an input in what we think as a production process that generates this information and these incentives. And the idea is that we can formalize this production process using the apparatus of information and mechanism design and leverage the structure and the power of this apparatus to understand something about the value of data. The key is that there is an auxiliary mathematical problem, which is called the dual of that production process, and out of that auxiliary problem comes, I would say naturally, the economic value of each individual's data. And a key result that we derive is the decomposition of this value into two parts. The first is going to be the payoff that the user of this data derives directly from the outcome that is obtained by using an individual's data. The second is a form of externality that the use of an individual's data generates for other individuals' data. And it's an externality that comes from the fact of using the data to manage the incentives of these agents who interact.
Can I ask you just
Yes.
a question? Maybe it's the
second part of your decomposition. When I think of the value of individual data, often they don't need data about yourself personally. They need some statistical information about a person like you. So the value of data to a company may be huge if they don't yet have somebody like you, because then by learning about you, they learn about a zillion other people. Or if they already know the information about somebody similar to you, the value is zero. It's still you, but that depends a lot on whether that information can or cannot be obtained. Is that your second point? Or
no.
No. Okay.
So that's a great question that does me clarify an important thing.
So a different way, in your view on what you're doing here, individual data is basically additive. It's my information, it's complete, and there is no externality?
Well, there is an externality that may come from the fact, which has been studied and highlighted in the literature, that your data may help me platform learn something about him. That's not what we are talking about. Imagine a situation in which either you have already learned everything that can be learned about an individual, so I know everything about him, I don't need your data to learn about him, or a situation in which just one person's data is not informative about another person's data for the purpose that the platform is interested. It's not because we want to say those externalities don't exist, but because we want to highlight a different kind of externality that we feel has not been highlighted before.
Thanks.
Okay, so let me jump into the model, and I'm going to consider a simplified version of the baseline model that we studied. And I'm going to use an e-commerce story to present this model. So imagine a two-sided marketplace where there is one e-commerce platform, one seller who sells through that platform, and many buyers who buy through the platform. Okay? For now, let's assume that for every buyer, the platform already knows a record of personal characteristics. And let me assume that that record exactly pins down the valuation that the buyer has for the seller's product. I'm going to call that valuation omega. And because of this, I'm going to refer to omega as the type of the record. Okay? There are going to be different types of records. And later, I'm going to relax this assumption that the platform already owns all the data. A database, given this, is just a collection of the buyer's data record, and I'm going to denote by, let's see if this works. That's okay. Q of omega is going to be the quantity of omega records in the database. Okay. The seller is going to know the composition of the database, so it's going to know the frequency of the different type of records in the database, and so the different type of buyers, but it's not going to be able to observe the data of a specific buyer, and so the valuation of that buyer for the product. Whenever the seller meets with a buyer, the seller is supposed to offer a price to buy the product. Now, I'm going to denote by UA omega the payoff that the platform gets for each transaction between a buyer and a seller when the offer is A and the valuation is omega. And similarly, pi is going to be the profit of the seller, for interacting with that buyer. And here I'm subsuming the decision of the buyer to buy the product or not into these payouts. Okay? The problem of the platform, which we call an intermediation problem, is the following. Whenever a buyer meets with the seller and they start to interact, the platform can provide the seller some information about the data record of the buyer, so it has to influence the price that the seller offers to the buyer. So this is going to be an instance of an information design problem that has been studied before. Now let me present some basic analysis of this simple model. So this intermediation problem can be expressed, as we know, in terms of designing a mechanism by which the platform recommends a price offered to the seller for each buyer, where the platform uses the data of the buyer to decide which price to recommend. Okay? So we can think about x of A omega as the quantity of buyers whose record is of type omega for which the platform recommends a price of A. Okay? Then the platform is going to try to maximize the overall payoff that it derives from interacting all the buyers with the seller, subject to two constraints. The first says that the platform has to use all the data records, so the platform has to make a recommendation for every buyer. Okay? And it has to respect the quantity of the different types that are in the database. And the second constraint is an incentive compatibility constraint that says if the platform recommends a price A to the seller, it has to be optimal for the seller to actually follow through with that recommendation based on the information that the seller can learn from the fact that the mechanism conditions the recommendation on the data that the platform has. Okay? Now, this is a simple, nice linear problem. So we can introduce multipliers for the two constraints. V is going to be the multiplier for the first
Sorry.
constraint. Yeah.
Did we account somewhere for the fact that the price should be palatable for the consumer as well?
That's what I was saying by saying that
Well, that was in the U.
subsumed
Sorry.
in
Yeah.
the payoffs.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
It's subsumed that if the
Yeah.
price is above the valuation, there is going to be no trade. So V is going to be the multiplier, so to speak, of the first constraint, and lambda is going to be the multiplier of the second constraint. And then you can look at what I was saying is this auxiliary mathematical problem, which is called the dual of this linear program. And that's what we call the data value problem. Why? Because at the optimum, the value of the multiplier for the first constraint, which we can think about the resource constraint that says there are inputs of type omega, and the platform has to use these inputs in a production process where the outcome of that production, the output of that production process is information. So the multiplier is going to capture the economic value of that input. Okay? And it's going to assign a value to each unit of the record of type omega in the data. Now, this problem has a very specific structure, but instead of describing it at this level, let me tell you about the main implication, or one of the main implications that this structure has. So to do that, let me introduce this object, T of A omega. So for each type of records, for each valuation of the buyer, and for each price offer, this object basically summarizes the incentives that the seller has to deviate from the recommended price or follow the recommended price, conditional on knowing the valuation of the buyer. So if the seller knew the valuation of the buyer, right, this aggregates the incentives to deviate, offer higher price or a lower price. Then our main result is that you can decompose this value of each data record into two parts, as I was saying before. The first part, which is the U star, basically is what we call the direct payoff. This is the payoff that the platform derives from the outcome that it directly generates with the data of a specific buyer. So for instance, think about this direct payoff as the share of the profit of a transaction between a buyer and a seller that the platform keeps for itself. Okay? When I buy from a specific seller and I pay 10, if the platform keeps for that transaction $3, that's the U star. Okay? There is another component, which is the externality component, that comes from the fact that just by the fact that I'm in the database and I have a specific valuation, I may influence what the platform is able to achieve with other buyers, potentially of a different type. And this is captured by this derivative because it says for every other type of record, so every other possible buyer, what's the effect of, at the margin, of me being in the database with a specific valuation? Okay? So that's a kind of externality, as shown by the second part of this last line. The first part of this last line tells us a little bit where the externality comes from. What's the source of that externality? And it comes from the fact that records of type omega, by being in the database, may help or hinder the ability of the platform to achieve a specific outcome, so a specific price offer and a specific trade with other type of buyers. And the way in which the omega data records may do this is to relax or tighten the insertive constraints. That's why this part here depends on the term that I put at the top, which I said aggregates these incentives to follow the recommendations or not. Okay. So I realized that this abstract description of this decomposition. So next I'm going to present an example that I hope will help understand where these externalities come from. But if there are questions, more than happy to take them. Yeah.
So we're thinking like a finite data set, like a finite number of consumers here, because I assume if you have like just an infinite, or these are measure zero consumers, that the externality disappears.
So we are thinking about big data, so large databases, finite but large, so that I can think about changing at the margin the quantity of one single type of record. Okay. Any other question? Okay. So here is a more concrete application. So again, we're talking about this platform, and imagine that.
Sorry, can I follow up?
Yeah.
But it is still just thinking about the intensity within a category. Because the queue is like a density, so you're varying the density. It's not like you're like introducing an entirely new type of person. Like going back to the earlier question that maybe we don't know a whole lot about the academics at UC at San Diego, and if we had the first observation of a such person, then. But so this is.
If you think about adding a non-negligible measure, you could resolve the problem.
Right, so you could solve it at zero, I guess.
And then you could extract what. But the important point is that the measure matters.
But I guess another way to ask the question: does that Q have to be positive everywhere, or can I think about the one-sided derivative at zero when I start adding of a particular type of consumer?
Well, I mean, if Q for a type of the record is zero, it's not going to show.
So, but I'm thinking about be at zero and look at increasing it infinitesimally from zero to something positive.
Then you can compute it, but the point is that Q matters. So the value that you find when Q is small may be very different than the value that you find when Q is large.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So as I was saying, let's make this a little more concrete. Suppose that the platform cares about both the profit of the seller, which if we normalize the cost to zero, is just the revenue from the price. That's the blue part. Okay. But the platform also cares about, loosely speaking, giving these buyers access to good deals because it wants the buyers to come back and buy again in the future on the platform. That's the red part, which is the surplus that the buyer gets away with if there is trade, right? Now, let's assume that these valuations go from 1 to 10, discrete. Let's suppose, just to put some numbers, that if the seller had to offer a uniform price to all the database, so taking into account the frequencies of the different type of buyers, it would be optimal to set the price of 7. Okay? Doesn't matter the specific number. And just to look at the more interesting case, let me assume that the platform cares more about the buyers than the seller. I can also solve the other case, but it's less interesting. So in this case, you can apply the machinery and compute explicitly the value of the different types of data records and the externalities. And what you find is that the values are these. And why? Because what the platform is going to try to do is to use the data to limit as much as possible the ability of the seller to price discriminate between the different types of buyers. This problem has been solved before by Bergman, Brooks, and Morris on the information design part. This is the dual part of finding the value of the different type of data records. And the idea is that all the buyers whose valuation is less than 7 are going to trade in a way that they manage to retain the entire surplus from the trade. That's the omega, which is valued at 1 minus r by the platform. Okay. The other buyers, the buyers who have a valuation sufficiently large, are going to fund a price equal to 10, so an expected profit, an expected profit equal to 7 for the seller. So the seller is going to get away with an expected profit that's exactly equal to 7, and only the buyers whose valuation is sufficiently large are going to fund this expected profit. And there are going to be positive externalities for the buyers whose valuation is sufficiently low, and negative externalities for those whose valuation is higher. Why? Because what the platform is going to do intuitively is pull together buyers with a sufficiently low valuation with buyers with a higher valuation, and recommend that the seller offers a low price. If the fractions are right, the seller is going to find that to be an optimal recommendation to follow. Okay, so the records with a low omega are going to help the platform achieve the goal of giving good deals to buyers whose valuation is high. And the only reason why the platform can pull this off is because there are low valuation buyers in the data. Okay, so this graph on the right shows the value of the different type of records as a function of omega, and you can see that low omega records can be more valuable than high omega records exactly because of this externality that they have in the way in which they are used. Okay. And so if you were to assess the value of the different type of record just based on the direct payoff, just based on the profit that the platform makes for each transaction, you're going to miss this important part of the actual value that the platform delivers. Okay. Any question about this? Okay, so let me derive a couple of implications from what I just said.
Simone,
Yes.
so I'm the non-economist here. So what is the exact mechanism that you use when you transfer the surplus? I mean, I'm used to thinking about this in a bundling context and other things. I'm trying to figure out the institutional form this would take.
Yes, so one way to think about this is that the platform could create market segments and tell the seller, look, this is the segmentation of the market that I constructed. And for instance, in this segment, it's full of buyers with low valuation, but there are also some buyers with high valuation. But there are so few that it's optimal for you to charge a low price. Those lucky buyers who end up in that segment get away with high surplus. So they are happy and they come back.
This requires all the normal constraints of against arbitrage and all the other things to make that work. So
yeah, and I'm also assuming that this platform is a monopolist and so on. Yeah. You can squeeze in some competition consideration, but
all that. Yeah. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. But what I'm trying to highlight here is this idea that data can be used in a clever way that adds value beyond what may seem the immediate value of, well, this buyer trades, I get $3, so that's the value of
because it allows the segmentation you're talking about to extract more service from each one.
Another way to say it is the data gives informational advantage to the platform, and we are kind of valuing the informational advantage on an individual basis of each individual data, rather than in the aggregate. So a couple of implications. The first is, well, you may think about how could data markets compensate individuals for their personal data, which is something that has been called creating a data dividend in the market. So a simple result,
Can I just? I think this is about I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but to me it sounds like this is sort of the value for having these individuals in the data set rather than knowing more or less about them. Because you could think about a world where I am in the data set, but the platform just doesn't know much about me, and they have to use some whatever population average based on my characteristic to figure out what my value would be. Whereas in your case, it seems like the platform is always assumed to have perfect information about the individuals, and you're looking at if there are more individuals of certain types. How does that affect?
Great. So in the paper, we actually allow these data records to have different degrees of informativeness
Okay, yeah.
about the
But so far what you've shown is
Yeah.
Okay.
But even in that case, the thing that we want to highlight is this ability of exploiting the composition of the database.
Sure.
Okay? Which of course is valuable only if you have a non-trivial strategic interaction to influence. Okay? But the other thing is that even if you have to rely on an average of the population, what we would want to say is, first you do your calculations for a specific buyer. You may use somebody else's data that is relevant for that buyer. You call that the data record of that buyer, and then you start with our numbers. So it's a distinction between learning versus using what you know. So by standard results, you can show that the total payoff that the platform derives from managing these interactions, okay, like the balance sheet, the bottom line of the balance sheet, can be written as the sum of these individual values times the quantity of the different type of records, which means that the values that we derive assign shares of the total payoff of the platform to the different type of records. Okay? So at least what we obtain is a benchmark against which you can compare and assess compensations that may arise in the market for the different type of record. Okay? And it's a benchmark that takes into account the real economic value, so to speak, of the different types of data.
Wait, hold on. So the point of the earlier example is that I shouldn't just look at the price. So I observe an exchange between buyer and seller. The price at which that exchange occurs by itself is not necessarily a good measure of the value of that particular data record, because I'm ignoring the fact that the presence of that data record would allow the platform to segment in some way.
Yeah.
Now, when you say that you want to use this as a benchmark for how I might assess how people should be compensated for their data, then this raises another problem, which is whether I choose to give up my data to the platform or not is going to depend on whether USO chooses to give it up or not, right?
No, excellent. I get to that. Yeah. You're anticipating 5 slides. You're too fast, sorry. But just to make starker the point, if you only have 2 types of records, like 6 and 7, 6 is going to get away with 0 surplus because, of course, the seller knows that the seller can charge at least 6. Right? However, the value for 6 is going to be positive, and the value for 7 is going to be 0 if you have at least half 6 in the database. Okay, you have a complete mismatch between what's the surplus, which will be the direct payoff, and the actual value. Okay. So the second implication is, suppose you are interested about properties of the demand for data by platforms or data users or intermediaries. We show that our V star, our value defines the preferences over databases, the entire space of databases. You can map these preferences. They are pinned down by these V's. And these V's are very similar to the marginal utility of a standard consumer, which means, for instance, that you can very easily set up a problem of choosing an optimal database subject to a budget constraint of resources that this platform can spend to acquire different type of data records. You can easily study the substitutability or complementarity between different types of records. In the previous example with 6 and 7, those two types of records are perfect complements, for instance. And you can show that the incentives of a platform to merge different databases, potentially by acquiring a different platform, is also pinned down by DSBs at the original databases. So if you give me the original databases and I calculate the Bs, I can tell you whether there is a strict incentive to merge or not. Now, so far, I assume that the platform already owns all the data, that the data is available for free to the platform. Okay? But of course, that clashes with the idea of privacy. Broadly speaking, the idea that with privacy regulation, the attempt is at least to give some control over sharing to the individuals, to the users, right? But of course, picking up on Rakesh's comment, the incentives to share intrinsically depend on how the data is going to be used by the platform. Okay? So you can think about, at an abstract level, at privacy as adding constraints to the use of data records. Okay? But which type of constraints? Well, here are a few, but of course, you can think. I'm sure you can think about other type of constraints. So please, I will be very happy to discuss this further with you. For instance, if different kinds of regulation change the punishment, so to speak, that the platform can impose on a buyer for not sharing the data, that's going to affect the participation constraint of these different type of buyers. Okay? If we think about data as hard information, like age or my address or my social security number, then privacy can introduce some sort of verifiable truth-telling constraints on the mechanism that the platform can use. Or if you think about data as soft information, like the inferred case that can be inferred by the choices that I make online, then the platform is going to be able to use only information that I truthfully reveal through my interaction with the platform. Okay? And this creates a truth-telling constraint, truth-telling constraint. Now, to put this in context, let's go back to the two-sided market situation where there is one platform, one seller, and many buyers. Now, let's drop that assumption that the platform already owns the data and instead has to incentivize the participation of the buyers and sharing of their data. Now, to formalize that, I need to add a payoff for the buyer. Think about just the surplus from trading. Now, as before, we can still formalize the intermediation problem for the platform as choosing a mechanism. Yes.
I think I'm still... Here in this setup, what you're calling data is my willingness to pay.
That's buyer, yes.
Right? But in practice, that would not be the data that I would be exchanging with other people, right? I would be trying to infer that from observed behavior. So now, for example, suppose the observed behavior is that I bought a book from Yuso. The record of that transaction is owned by both Yuso and myself.
Yes. But,
So, yeah.
But my point is that when you want to use that behavior to infer something about taste, you have to keep incentive compatibility into account. And if you want to use what you infer to do something with it through the mechanism, whether the behavior, what you can infer from the behavior is influenced by the mechanism through incentive compatibility. Right?
But to purchase a record of that behavior, right, which is what you'd want to make the inference about my willingness to pay, it's actually available from two sources, right?
Sure, but Yuso is the platform. It's already the platform, okay?
No, I think I'm some other platform in this example.
You're some other, right? So,
Right.
So as I said, in the stylized model, data is my willingness to pay. But typically, the platform would not know my willingness to pay. It would infer that from other sources. So for example, you might infer my willingness to pay from the fact that I bought a book from USO. But now the record of that transaction is owned both by myself as well as USO.
Yeah, so if I understand correctly, the direction in which you're going, which is I can buy from both,
Yes.
so there is competition between the two of you.
Yes.
So how much I have to compensate depends on this competition. I totally agree. It's not in here for now, but there is still a question of what's the value, right? If I have to buy it,
Right.
what's my willingness to pay? And then maybe because I have a stronger bargaining position, I may be able to buy it at a low price. But for instance, what's the maximum price at which I'm willing to buy it? So as I was saying, you can still construct this as designing the mechanism, because you still have to make a price recommendation for each record. So you will still have to satisfy the resource constraint that was up before and the obedience constraint, the extended compatibility that was up before. But now we can add the other constraint. We can add a participation constraint that has to do with the fact that because of privacy, a buyer can just walk away and get some reservation payoff. We can add a truth-telling constraint with verifiable information, so hard data, which says, well, if you tell me what you actually are, I'm going to do this. But you can always decide not to share anything. And in that case, I will have some way of treating the buyers who don't share anything, which may be shaped by privacy regulation. I may be able to punish them really harshly or not. But that's going to shape the incentives to share in the first place. Or if we think about soft data, I will have a more standard incentive compatibility constraint that says it has to be optimal for the buyer to report truthfully their valuation rather than pretending to be somebody else. Okay? But this is again a linear program, just like before. So the first observation is that, yes, I started out assuming that the platform doesn't have the data records, but if at the end of the day all these constraints have to be satisfied anyway, it is as if the platform already owns all the data and all the database like before. The only difference is that the platform is solving the same production problem, just subject to stricter constraints. Okay? So the only difference between no privacy and privacy is different constraints of a production problem starting from the same database. Okay? Moreover, because it's still a linear program, the same machinery applies before, so we can still calculate the value of each individual data record, depending on the type. As before, there are going to be the two components that I liked before, the direct payoff and the externalities coming from managing the obedience constraints. But there are now other components that come from the constraints that were added because of privacy. So the insight here is that by adding privacy regulations and so adding incentive constraints on how the platform can use different types of records, we are introducing richer externalities across the different type of records, where these externalities come from how the data is used to manage incentives. Again, not to learn, those externalities are important, but there are also these externalities. So building on this, let me just put up some questions that one may wonder about and some preliminary answers. The first is, does privacy increase or decrease the value of the whole database? Now that I told you that it's like working with a given database, just subject to more constraints, obviously the value is going to be lower for the whole database, right? What about the value of the individual data records? Are they going to be higher or lower because of privacy? Well, here the answer is it depends. We have examples where the value of some type of records goes up when you introduce privacy, and the value of others go down. So the point that we want to make is that privacy can have redistributive effects, not just between the data subjects and the data holders, so us and the firms. Maybe we have more bargaining power, we can extract more, But there are also potentially redistributive effects between individuals. There are going to be winners and losers from privacy regulations. And finally, this goes to Rakesh's question. Are individuals going to be compensated for the actual value of their personal data? Well, once you realize that paying or setting up a payment scheme up front for the consumers for their data influences their incentives to share their data in the first place, then you have to be careful because you have to add explicitly a transfer to the mechanism, then solve jointly the value and the transfer, and then compare to figure out whether those transfers reflect in any way the actual value of the data that you're buying. And this is what we want to do next, but just as a framework, as an approach. Okay.
You're at 45 minutes,
Still 45 minutes.
so you still have 15 minutes left.
So I talked for 45. Okay.
You started at 47 after, so.
Okay. Good. There's plenty of time for questions. So let me summarize, and then maybe we can have an open discussion. So 3 simple things. With this research, we are trying to suggest a framework to think about the value of data by looking at data as an input in a production process that can be formalized using information mechanism design, which we're very familiar with. From this comes what we think is an important point, which is the economic value of data, at least in this setting where there are complex interactions mediated through data, has multiple components. One is an obvious one, which is the direct payoff, but there are also these externalities that could be significant. And finally, this idea that privacy constrains the use of data and introduce new externalities and potentially redistributive effects between different data sources. That's it. Thank you.
Any further questions?
So one could use the framework presumably to ask and answer the following question, which is if I were to regulate the intermediary so as to maximize producer and consumer surplus, I'm guessing one answer would be the intermediary should provide all information to the seller to allow the seller to perfectly price discriminate. That would maximize total surplus, right?
No, hold on, because I hope I remember it correctly, but the solution that Bergman, Brooks, and Martin suggest, where you maximize the surplus of the buyers, also maximizes total surplus, just shifts it entirely.
Right, there would be 2 possible solutions here.
Right, but that's not the solution that fully discloses the information to the seller. Right, so it's not obvious that the surplus maximizing, the overall surplus maximizing solution is also the one that gives all the surplus to the seller. Right, there are other possibilities. The important thing is that the value of the individual's data is going to be dramatically affected by the solution that you pick. Right, because what they didn't put up there, but if you do perfect price discrimination, the value is just going to be the surplus that you extract. Right? So very simple. There is going to be no externality whatsoever. Right? If you do it this way, there are going to be externalities. So, for instance, you may be in a situation in which you say, you buyers with a high willingness to pay, you're actually getting less than your willingness to pay to subsidize what I have to pay the low willingness to pay buyers because of what they deliver. Now, of course, the high willingness to pay buyers are also getting away with surplus when trading, so it's not clear when you keep all the players into account and how you can transfer surplus, either by paying for their data or by letting them buy the product at a low price. What's the option? Yes, please.
Simone, could you use your framework to extend in the direction of neighbor data union? So some people suggest that a subset of customers here could put their information together and collectively go to the platform, say. So could you do this, or is it so? You could restrict to omega as some adjacent intervals. I don't know how you could extend it.
Well, first of all, you can replace my platform with a data union.
The platform.
Now, the data union plays the role of this intermediary that has the data and packages it and gives it to whoever is interested. Now, in that process, different type of data records are going to acquire different values. And so, first of all, you want to know that value if you want to pay back to your data sources what they give you. You also want to know the value because in the downstream market, if you're bargaining with the buyer of this packaged data, and they offer a price, are you underselling, overselling? What's the value of what you have to sell, right? And separately, you can say now let's keep the e-commerce platform, right? And the data union is thinking about how much should I ask for the data that they provide. If I provide data of different types, data records of different types, what would be the asking price? Or what would be the maximum price that I can push the platform to pay? And this kind of gives a benchmark. And you could say, oh, well, but the low willingness to pay buyers are worthless. I shouldn't ask much. And my results say, well, maybe no. Right? You have to be careful. Right? So another thing here is, suppose that there is a market where there are prices for different type of data records, and you observe this market and you say, oh, these are equilibrium prices, right? Do they reflect the actual values? You may say, well, let me compare the prices with what I call the direct payoffs. And you may find that they are off. You may say, well, there is something weird in the market. Maybe the market is not competitive, it's not in equilibrium, there is something wrong going on. And what I would say, well, maybe the comparison is not the right one. You have to compare with what's the actual willingness to pay of this platform, which could be quite off from the direct payoff.
So because these records are complementary, like going back to something like the data union, is it going to be balanced, like budget balanced? Am I going to be able to, it sounds to me like I'd have to.
What do you mean budget balance?
Well, because these records are complementary, it's like you're not going to be able to charge as much for the whole data set that you would need to then compensate the individuals for what they provided. So I guess that there's a problem that way, right?
I thought, in fact, your answer to Tommaso's question was going to be these data unions are going to be unstable because the value that a union can get depends on its precise composition. And I may look at one union versus another and realize that when I shift from one union to this other union, it changes how much that union gets and potentially affects my share. So in fact, I would say data unions would be prone to instability, and which may be an explanation for why they haven't arisen.
Or there may be a pressure towards uniformity.
There can only be one.
Only be one or all the same,
Yeah.
so that they kind of converge towards the optimal composition, given a certain budget. Yeah. Which is another thing that we want to highlight, that these values are composition specific. So, as opposed to a situation in which, suppose that you use this data to solve a decision problem. There is no strategic interaction that you're managing. Then the composition is completely irrelevant.
But I guess Microsoft is slightly different still, that if the value of my data is 2 and the value of Ricky's data is 2, but then the whole data set is worth 3, then if we sell it for 3, we can't both get 2. So
but the total value is equal to the sum of the individual values.
Because you're doing to the dual.
Yes. So in that case, you're not gonna.
Absent incentive constraints.
Yeah, but in the last version where you had
It's always like that. It's
Okay.
always like that. So if you add what they call the privacy constraints, the objective of the dual is still going to be exactly this. Okay? So at the optimum, that sum is going to be equal to the total payoff from the problem above. Okay? So the values are going to just allocate the total value that you generate. You will never be in a situation in which you have to pay more than the value that you actually generate. Okay? It's only shifting values between different type of records relative to the U star. Okay? So if you take the U star, you multiply by Q and you sum up, you're still going to get the total payoff. But the result says you have to rearrange that total payoff by taking away from U star for some type of records and adding it to some other type of records.
It's funny to me. The whole time I think about Stigler's classic paper on bundling, which is by putting consumers together, you can use surplus to fund different amounts and to extract a total amount of surplus more. And in the spirit, that's sort of what you're doing.
It's bundling informationally.
Correct. And so, but it's the same notion that is you can basically homogenize the consumer value in ways that allow you to, the product to extract more, even though there's an individual variation in value, by using some of the excess surplus of one effectively to fund the other. And it's a nice model, and it's interesting because it's an example of how we can use the presence of externalities to harness towards a more efficient outcome, assuming that the cost constraints would make that so that individually priced ones wouldn't exist in this market, would be socially beneficial to exist.
Yeah, and the composition is telling you exactly how to shift.
Correct. That's really, that's an interesting idea. And it's the whole notion of using sort of, if you will, the way that they would talk about it is using the different surpluses to fund each other basically by putting them together is, to me, is very similar to the mechanism that Stigler thought of and is actually a nice implementation of it on the data side, which is quite nice.
Oh.
But there they had to have multiple products where you had individual consumers who had inversely correlated preferences for individual products. Here you're talking about the ability of a market maker to segment to reflect it without having to bundle them into an individual product.
And withhold the information from the seller.
Yeah.
That's the consequence of asymmetric information.
It's a different approach, but it's essentially, we've always known that bundling is a form of price discrimination in a weird way. You're doing it much more directly, essentially extracting it that way. And I think it's an interesting application.
Thank you.
All right, let me check online to make sure I'm not neglecting my duties. Well, no. We've with that the exhausting questions. Please join me in thanking Simone for a fascinating.